A woman walks into a dine ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and asks one question: "Can I stay?" The man who answers, scarred, silent, built from war and grief, says yes without knowing why. What starts as charity becomes something neither of them expected. She doesn't beg. He doesn't soften. But somewhere between the work and the silence, two people who've lost everything start building something that refuses to break. This is their story. If you want to see where it goes, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this one travels. Colt Reiner had stopped counting days sometime after the second winter alone. Time moved different out here. The ranch sat in a valley so remote that the nearest town was a day's ride. And even then, it was barely worth the name. Just a trading post, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse, and a stable run by a man who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and didn't talk much about it. Colt preferred it that way. He wasn't looking for company. The house was small. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the north, and a roof that leaked in exactly one spot no matter how many times he patched it. The barn was bigger than the house, which made sense. Horses mattered more than comfort. Livestock kept you alive. Everything else was just weather. He'd bought the land cheap after the war, back when he still thought starting over meant something. The seller had been eager to leave, too eager probably, but Colt didn't ask questions. He just signed the papers and rode out with a bill of sale and a wagon full of tools he barely knew how to use. That was 5 years ago. Maybe 6. He'd stopped keeping track of that too. The ranch wasn't much, but it was his. 60 acres of scrub grass and rocky soil that fought him every season. A creek that ran strong in spring and dried to a trickle by August. Enough pasture for a dozen head of cattle if he stretched it, and a few horses he rotated through work and rest. It wasn't prosperity, it was survival, and survival was all Colt had left. He woke before dawn out of habit, not necessity. The war had beaten early rising into him, and his body never forgot. He dressed in the cold, boots, shirt, suspenders, hat, and walked out into the gray light of October. The air smelled like frost and distance. He liked mornings. They were quiet, and quiet didn't ask anything of you. The horses were already stirring when he reached the barn. He fed them first, then the cattle, then checked the fence line along the eastern pasture where coyotes had been testing the wire. Everything was still intact. Good. He didn't have the energy for repairs today. By the time the sun broke over the hills, Colt had already worked 2 hours. He was back at the house pouring coffee that tasted like burnt dirt when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, something moving on the road that wasn't supposed to be there. But when he stepped onto the porch and shaded his eyes, he saw her clearly. A woman. Walking. She was still a quarter-mile out, but even from that distance, Colt could tell she wasn't local. She moved too slow, like every step cost her something. Her dress was torn at the hem, coated in dust so thick it looked like she'd been dragged behind a wagon. No hat, no bag, nothing. He set the coffee down and watched her approach. Most people didn't walk out here. If you were traveling, you rode or you took a wagon. Walking meant you'd lost something: your horse, your money, or your mind. Sometimes all 3. Colt had seen plenty of drifters over the years, men mostly, looking for work or running from something. He usually sent them on their way with a canteen and directions to the next town. He didn't have the resources to be charitable, and he sure as hell didn't have the patience. But this wasn't a man. She stopped at the edge of his property, just outside the fence that marked where his land began. She didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood there, swaying slightly like she was deciding whether to take another step or collapse where she stood. Colt walked down from the porch, boots crunching on the dry ground. He didn't say anything, not yet. He wanted to see what she'd do. Up close, she looked worse than he'd thought. Her face was sunburned, lips cracked and peeling. Her hair, dark, tangled, hung loose around her shoulders, and her hands were blistered raw. She couldn't have been more than 25, but exhaustion aged her. She looked like she'd been walking for weeks. "Water," she said. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Colt stared at her. "Where'd you come from?" She blinked, like the question didn't make sense. "East? That's a direction, not a place." "I know." She swayed again, and this time she caught herself on the fence post. "Do you have water or not?" He almost smiled. "Almost." Most people who showed up like this, half dead, desperate, came with a story. Some long explanation about bad luck or worse men, designed to pull sympathy out of you before you even realized you were giving it. But she didn't offer anything, just asked for water like it was the only thing that mattered. Colt turned without a word and walked back to the house. He came back with a canteen and held it out over the fence. She took it with both hands, unscrewed the cap, and drank. Not fast. She was too smart for that, but steady. When she finally stopped, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him. "Thank you." He nodded. "You should keep moving. Town's a day east if you follow the road." "I came from that direction." "Then go west. That's 2 days. Then you better start walking." She didn't move, just stood there, holding the canteen, looking at him like she was trying to figure out if he meant it. Colt frowned. "What?" "I'm asking if I can stay." "Stay where?" "Here." He laughed, a short, rough sound that didn't carry any humor. "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't know you, because I don't need help, because this isn't a boarding house." He took the canteen back. "Well, keep walking." She looked past him, toward the barn, the house, the stretch of land that rolled out in every direction. Then she looked back at him. "I can work," she said. "I know animals, I know fences, I know how to fix things." "I didn't ask what you know." "I'm not asking for charity, just a place to sleep and food. I'll earn it." Colt studied her. She was serious, stupid maybe, but serious. And there was something in her eyes, something stubborn and unbreakable, that reminded him of men he'd served with, men who didn't quit even when quitting made sense. "Where's your family?" he asked. "Don't have one." "Friends?" "No." "Money?" "No." "Then what the hell are you doing out here?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Surviving." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Colt knew that word. He'd lived it for years. And maybe that's why he didn't send her away right then. Maybe that's why he looked at her, this stranger with nothing, asking for even less, and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity. He didn't do pity, but recognition. "Barn," he said finally. "You sleep in the barn. You don't come in the house. You don't touch anything that isn't yours. And if I tell you to leave, you leave. No arguments." She nodded. "Understood." "What's your name?" "Mara Vance." "Colt Rayner." He turned and started walking back toward the barn. "Come on, I'll show you where you can sleep." "Yeah." The barn smelled like hay and horse sweat, familiar and thick. Colt led her to the back corner where he kept old saddles and broken tools he hadn't gotten around to fixing. There was a pile of straw near the wall, relatively clean, and a wool blanket folded on top of a crate. "That's yours," he said, pointing to the blanket. "Don't expect anything fancy." Mara looked around, taking it in without comment. Then she set down the canteen and sat on the crate, wincing as her legs bent. "Thank you," she said again. Colt grunted. "Don't thank me yet. Work starts at dawn. If you can't keep up, you're gone." "I'll keep up." He doubted that. She looked like a strong wind could knock her over. But he didn't argue. He just nodded and left her there, alone in the barn with the horses in the fading light. Okay. That night, Colt sat in the house and tried to figure out what the hell he'd just done. He didn't need help. He'd been running this place solo for years and it worked. Sure, it was hard. Everything out here was hard, but he managed. Adding another person just complicated things, especially a woman. Women needed things, privacy, protection, conversation. Colt didn't have the bandwidth for any of that, but he'd said yes. He stared into the fire, nursing a glass of whiskey that tasted worse than the coffee, and told himself it was temporary. She'd work a few days, realize how brutal it was, and leave on her own. Problem solved. Except when he looked out the window toward the barn, he saw a faint glow. A lantern, probably. And he wondered if she was still awake. Wondered what she was thinking. Wondered where the hell she'd come from and why she'd walked all the way out here with nothing. He drained the glass and went to bed. Mara didn't leave. The next morning, Colt woke to the sound of the barn door creaking open. He pulled on his boots and walked outside, expecting to find her gone. But she was there, standing near the water trough, washing her face and hands like she'd done it 100 times before. She looked up when she heard him. "Morning," he nodded. "You eat?" "Not yet." "Come on." He led her to the house and made breakfast. Eggs, bread, coffee. Nothing fancy. They ate in silence, sitting across
This
from each
story was
other at the
posted
small
on the
wooden
channel
table.
west of
Mara
Betrayal.
didn't ask questions.
Please do not
Didn't
repost
try to
it in
fill
any
the quiet
form.
with small talk. She just ate, methodically, like someone who'd gone hungry enough times to appreciate a meal. When they finished, Colt stood. "Let's go. We're mending the fence on the north pasture." She followed him without hesitation. The work was brutal. The fence had taken damage from a storm 2 weeks prior, posts knocked loose, wire tangled and torn. Colt had been putting off the repair because it required 2 people, and he didn't have 2 people. Until now. He handed Mara a pair of gloves and a hammer. "Hold the post steady while I drive it in." She did. For the next 4 hours, they worked in near silence. Colt drove posts into the hard ground while Mara held them in place, her hands shaking from the effort but never letting go. When they moved to stringing wire, she didn't flinch when the barbs caught her sleeve and tore through the fabric. She just kept working. By midday, Colt was impressed, and annoyed that he was impressed. "You've done this before," he said. Mara wiped sweat from her forehead. "My father had a farm, small one. I helped him with repairs." "Where is he now?" "Dead." Colt didn't push. He knew better. They finished the fence just before sunset. Mara's hands were blistered and bloody despite the gloves, but she didn't complain. She just washed them in the creek and wrapped them in strips of cloth Colt gave her. "You did good," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "Thanks." He walked back to the house, and she walked back to the barn. And that became the rhythm. Oh. Days turned into weeks. Mara worked harder than Colt expected. She wasn't strong, not like a man, but she was relentless. She mucked stalls, hauled water, repaired tools, and didn't ask for breaks. She learned fast, too. He showed her how to check a horse's hooves for stones, and the next day she did it without being asked. He mentioned the roof leaked, and 2 days later she'd climbed up there with tar and shingles and patched it herself. She didn't talk much. Neither did he. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there, like the wind or the cold, something you got used to. One evening, after a long day of moving cattle to the west pasture, Colt found her sitting outside the barn, staring at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. He sat down beside her. "You thinking about leaving?" She shook her head. "No?" "Why not?" "Because I like it here." He frowned. "It's hard work, no money, no comfort. Why would you like it?" Mara turned to look at him. "Because no one's trying to take it from me." Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He just sat there with her, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. Winter came fast. By November, the temperature had dropped below freezing most nights, and snow dusted the ground every morning. Colt moved Mara out of the barn and into the house, not out of kindness, but practicality. If she froze to death, he'd be back to working alone, and that didn't make sense. He gave her the second room, a cramped space with a narrow bed and a window that didn't close all the way. She didn't complain. She just moved her things in and kept working. They fell into a routine. Wake before dawn, feed the animals, check the fences, chop wood, haul water, eat, sleep, repeat. It should have been monotonous, soul-crushing even, but Colt found himself not hating it. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt shared. One night, after a particularly brutal day of clearing snow from the barn roof, they sat by the fire. Mara was mending a tear in her coat, and Colt was sharpening a knife he used for skinning game. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said. Colt looked up. "Go ahead." "Why'd you let me stay?" He didn't answer right away. He tested the edge of the knife against his thumb, then set it down. "I don't know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She smiled, just a little. "Fair enough." "Why'd you ask to stay?" he said. "Because I didn't have anywhere else to go." "That's not an answer either. Then we're even." He almost laughed. Almost. By December, the snow was waist deep in some places, and the work became a battle just to stay alive. They burned through firewood faster than Colt could chop it, and the cattle needed constant care to keep them from freezing. Every day was a test. But Mara never faltered. She worked beside him in the cold, her breath fogging in the air, her hands red and raw. And somewhere in the middle of that frozen hell, Colt realized something that scared him more than the war ever had. He didn't want her to leave. The realization didn't hit him all at once. It crept in slow like frost spreading across a window. It started with small things. The way Mara knew to add an extra log to the fire before the house got too cold. How she'd started leaving his coffee on the table in the morning, already poured, still hot. The sound of her footsteps overhead when he woke in the night, checking the animals during a storm because she knew he'd do the same thing, and she didn't want him going out alone. Colt had lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to share space with someone who didn't need constant instruction. Mara just knew. And the knowing settled into the routine until he couldn't remember what it had been like before she showed up. That scared him, because people left. That's what they did. They stayed until staying got hard, and then they found reasons to go. His parents had died when he was 14. The men he'd served with in the war, most of them were dead too, or scattered so far across the country he'd never see them again. And the woman he'd almost married before he bought the ranch? She'd taken one look at the land, the isolation, the sheer brutality of the life he was choosing, and walked away without a fight. He didn't blame her. Not really. It took a certain kind of crazy to choose this. But Mara had chosen it. Without being asked. Without knowing what it would cost her. And that's what scared him most. By mid-January, the snow was relentless. It fell in heavy sheets that turned the world into a colorless blur, and the wind howled through the valley like something alive and angry. Colt had seen bad winters before, but this one felt personal. Like nature had decided to test just how much two people could take. They worked in shifts now. One of them would stay inside, keeping the fire going and melting snow for water, while the other went out to check the livestock. The cattle huddled together in the low pasture, their breath steaming in the freezing air, and the horses stayed close to the barn where the wind couldn't reach them as hard. Colt hated sending Mara out into the cold, but she insisted. "I'm not helpless," she'd said one morning when he tried to argue. "And if you go out there alone and break your leg, we're both dead." She was right. He hated that too. One afternoon, when the snow had paused long enough to give them a few hours of weak sunlight, Colt decided to check the fence line along the northern border. It was the most exposed section of the property, and if the wire had come loose, the cattle could wander into the next valley and they'd lose them for good. "I'm coming with you," Mara said, already pulling on her coat. "You don't have to." "I know." She wrapped a scarf around her neck and grabbed a pair of gloves. "Let's go." They rode out together on horseback, the snow crunching under the animals' hooves. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, sharp and unforgiving, and Colt's fingers went numb even inside his gloves. Beside him, Mara rode in silence, her face half hidden by the scarf, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. When they reached the fence, Colt saw the damage immediately. Two posts had snapped under the weight of the snow, and the wire sagged low enough that a calf could step over it without trying. "Damn it," he muttered, dismounting. Mara swung down beside him. "We need new posts." "I know. Problem is, I don't have any up here." "Then we make do." She walked over to a cluster of trees a few yards away and started testing the trunks, looking for something strong enough to replace the broken posts. Colt watched her for a moment, then joined her. Together they found two saplings that might work. Not perfect, but good enough. He used his hatchet to chop them down while Mara cleared the broken posts from the ground. It took over an hour to get the new posts set and the wire restrung. By the time they finished, the sun was already sinking behind the hills, and the temperature was dropping fast. "We need to head back," Colt said, flexing his hands to get the blood moving again. Mara nodded, but as she turned toward her horse, she stumbled. Just a little. Enough that Colt noticed. "You all right?" "Fine. Just cold." He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. They mounted up and started back toward the ranch, the wind picking up again as darkness settled over the valley. Halfway home, Mara's horse stumbled. Colt pulled up short, turning in his saddle. "What happened?" "I don't know. He just—" Mara's voice was tight, strained. She was leaning forward in the saddle, one hand gripping the reins, the other pressed against her side. Colt rode up beside her. "Mara." She didn't answer. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mara, talk to me." "I'm fine," she said, but her voice shook. No, you're not. He dismounted and reached for her horse's rein, steadying the animal. Get down! I can ride! Get down!
This
She
story was
hesitated, then
posted on the
swung her leg
channel
over and
west of
slid to the
Betrayal.
ground.
Please
The
do
moment
not
her feet hit the
repost it
snow,
in any
her
form.
knees buckled. Colt caught her before she fell, his arm around her waist. What's wrong? He asked, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. Nothing. I just need a minute. He pulled her scarf down and saw the color draining from her face. You're not fine. What hurts? My side. It's nothing. Colt's jaw tightened. Let me see. It's just... Let me see. Reluctantly, Mara lifted the edge of her coat. Beneath it, her shirt was stained with blood. Not a lot, but enough. Colt's stomach dropped. When did this happen? When we were fixing the fence. The wire caught me. It's not deep. Why didn't you say anything? Because it's not deep. He stared at her, furious and terrified in equal measure. You're bleeding. It'll stop. Not if you keep riding. He looked around. They were still a mile from the house, and the light was fading fast. If they didn't move soon, they'd be riding in the dark. And that was a good way to get lost, or worse. Can you ride if I tie you to the saddle? He asked. Mara frowned. I'm not that bad. Can you or can't you? She exhaled, frustrated. Yes, I can ride. Good. He helped her back onto her horse, then mounted his own. Stay close. If you feel dizzy, you tell me. Understand? I understand. They rode in silence, Colt keeping one eye on the path and the other on Mara. She held herself upright, but he could see the effort it took. Her breathing was shallow, and every few minutes she'd shift in the saddle like she was trying to find a position that didn't hurt. By the time they reached the house, it was fully dark, and Mara was barely holding on. Colt dismounted and pulled her down from the horse, half carrying her to the door. Inside, he set her on a chair by the fire and lit the lamps. The room filled with warm light, and he finally got a good look at the wound. It wasn't as bad as he'd feared, but it wasn't good either. The barbed wire had torn through the fabric of her shirt and sliced a jagged line across her ribs. It had stopped bleeding, but the edges were raw and dirty. I need to clean this, Colt said, already moving toward the basin to heat water. Mara leaned back in the chair, her eyes closed. I told you it wasn't deep. Deep enough? He poured water into a pot and set it over the fire, then grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from the cupboard. When the water was warm, he brought it over and knelt beside her. This is going to hurt. I know. He worked carefully, cleaning the wound and wiping away the dried blood. Mara didn't flinch, but he saw her hands grip the armrests of the chair, her knuckles white. Why didn't you tell me when it happened? He asked, his voice low. Because we had work to do. You could have passed out up there. But I didn't. Colt paused, the cloth still in his hand. You're too stubborn for your own good. Mara opened her eyes and looked at him. So are you. He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he poured whiskey over the wound to disinfect it, and this time Mara did flinch, sucking in a sharp breath through her teeth. Sorry, Colt muttered. Liar. He wrapped the wound with a strip of clean cloth, tying it tight enough to hold, but not so tight it cut off circulation. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. You need to rest. I'm fine. Mara, she sighed. Fine. I'll rest. He helped her to her room and made sure she was settled before heading back to the kitchen. The adrenaline that had carried him through the ride home was fading now, replaced by something heavier. Fear, maybe. Or the memory of fear. He'd seen men die from wounds smaller than that. Infection, fever, blood loss. It didn't take much out here where doctors were days away and medicine was whatever you could scrounge up on your own. Colt poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. He thought about Mara in the next room, thought about how close she'd come to falling off that horse, and felt something twist in his chest. He didn't want to care. Caring made you weak. It gave the world something to take from you. But it was too late. He already cared. The next morning, Mara was up before him. Colt found her in the kitchen, standing at the stove with one hand braced against the counter and the other stirring a pot of oatmeal. She moved slowly, carefully, but she was moving. What the hell are you doing? He asked. Making breakfast. You should be in bed. I've been in bed. Now I'm making breakfast. She glanced at him over her shoulder. Sit down. It's almost ready. Colt wanted to argue, but the look on her face told him it wouldn't do any good. So he sat. And when she set a bowl in front of him a few minutes later, he ate without comment. They worked lighter that day, just feeding the animals and checking the water. Mara moved stiffly, her hand occasionally drifting to her side, but she didn't complain. Colt watched her out of the corner of his eye, ready to step in if she faltered, but she didn't. Over the next few days, the wound healed cleanly. No infection, no fever, just slow, steady recovery. By the end of the week, Mara was back to full work, and Colt stopped checking on her every 5 minutes. But something had shifted between them. It was subtle at first. The way Colt started asking her opinion on things he'd normally decide himself. The way Mara stopped hesitating before sitting down at the table with him. The conversations that stretched longer than they needed to, not because there was more to say, but because neither of them wanted to stop talking. One night, after they'd finished repairing a section of the barn roof that had started to sag, they sat outside on the porch steps, watching the stars. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and the air was cold but still. "You ever think about leaving?" Mara asked. Colt glanced at her. "Leaving where?" "Here. The ranch. All of it." He thought about it. "No." "Why not?" "Because there's nowhere else to go." He leaned back against the post, his arms crossed. "This is it. This is what I've got." Mara was quiet for a moment. "That sounds lonely." "Maybe." He looked at her. "What about you? You ever think about leaving?" She shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because for the first time in my life, I'm not running." She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "I spent years moving from place to place, never staying long enough to matter. I got tired of it." "So you walked into the middle of nowhere and decided to stay?" "Yeah." She smiled faintly. "Guess I'm crazy." "Guess so." They sat in silence for a while, the stars bright and endless above them. Colt didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way the space between them had stopped feeling like distance. It felt like something else now, something he didn't have a name for. "You're good at this," Mara said eventually. "At what?" "Running a ranch, taking care of things. You make it look easy." Colt snorted. "It's not." "I know, but you do it anyway." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He just sat there beside her, the cold seeping into his bones, and wondered when he'd stopped feeling alone. By February, the worst of the winter had passed. The snow still fell, but lighter now, and the days were getting longer. Colt and Mara settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like something sustainable. They worked together without needing to speak. She'd hand him a tool before he asked for it. He'd start a task and she'd finish it without being told. It was efficient, seamless, and dangerous, because the more time Colt spent with her, the harder it became to imagine the ranch without her. One afternoon, while they were hauling firewood from the storage shed to the house, Mara paused and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What happened to you before this?" Colt set down the wood he was carrying and straightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you don't talk about it. Where you came from, what you did. You just exist, like the past doesn't matter." He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "It doesn't." "That's not true." "It is for me." Mara studied him, her expression unreadable. "You were in the war." It wasn't a question. Colt exhaled slowly. "Yeah." "Which side?" "Does it matter?" "Maybe." He picked up the wood again and started walking toward the house. Mara followed. "I fought for the Union," he said after a while. 3 years. Indiana infantry. Saw action in Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia. Lost more friends than I care to count. And after? After, I came out here. Figured I'd start over. Be someone different." He dropped the wood by the fireplace and turned to face her. "Didn't work." "Why not?" "Because you can't outrun what you've done. You just carry it with you." Mara looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. "I know what that's like," she said quietly. "Yeah?" She nodded. "My father died when I was 16. Fever. My mother remarried a year later to a man who didn't want me around, so I left. Worked where I could, moved when I had to. I've been running ever since. Until now. Until now. They stood there in the warm glow of the fireplace, the weight of their shared history settling between them like snow on a roof.
This story
Heavy,
was
but
posted
not
on the
unbearable.
channel west of Betrayal.
Thank you.
Please do not
Mara
repost
said.
it in any form.
For what? For letting me stay. Colt looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept locked down for years. You don't have to thank me, he said. You've earned it. She smiled just a little. Still, that night, Colt lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Mara moving around in the next room, settling in for the night, and the sound of it, the proof that she was there, that she wasn't leaving, made his chest ache. He told himself he didn't need anyone, that he was fine on his own. But the truth was, he hadn't been fine in a long time. And now, with Mara here, he wasn't sure he could go back to being alone. The thought terrified him. By March, the snow had started to melt, revealing patches of brown grass and mud. The creek swelled with runoff, and the air smelled like wet earth and new growth. It was still cold, but the kind of cold that promised spring instead of threatening death. Colt and Mara spent their days preparing for the season ahead, repairing tools, mending fences, planning where to plant the small vegetable garden Mara had suggested. It felt strange planning for the future. Colt had spent so long just trying to survive the present that thinking ahead felt almost foolish, but Mara made it seem possible. One evening, as they were walking back from the barn, Mara stopped and looked out at the valley. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of gold and purple, and the wind had died down to almost nothing. "It's beautiful here," she said. Colt followed her gaze. "Yeah, it is. Do you ever get used to it?" "No." He turned to look at her. "But that's not a bad thing." She smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Colt saw something in her face that hadn't been there before. Peace, maybe, or hope. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. "Me too." They walked the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the house, Colt held the door open for her. She stepped inside, and he followed, closing the door behind them. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Spring came in pieces, not all at once. First, the ice on the creek broke apart with sharp cracks that echoed through the valley. Then the mud appeared, thick and relentless, turning every step into a battle. The cattle grew restless, eager for fresh grass that hadn't started growing yet, and the horses shed their winter coats in clumps that stuck to everything. Colt hated spring. It was messy and unpredictable, and it always brought more work than he was ready for. But this year felt different. This year, he had help. Mara had proven herself 10 times over by now, but she still worked like she had something to prove. She was up before dawn most mornings, already feeding the horses by the time Colt made it to the barn. She never asked for days off or complained about the mud or the cold mornings that still bit through their clothes. She just worked. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, Colt realized he'd stopped thinking of her as temporary. One afternoon in early April, they were repairing the gate on the south pasture when a rider appeared on the ridge. Colt saw him first, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, moving slow and deliberate. "We expecting someone?" Mara asked, shading her eyes. "No." Colt set down the hammer and walked toward the fence line, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept strapped to his saddle. Visitors were rare out here, and the ones who showed up unannounced usually brought trouble. The rider came closer, and Colt relaxed slightly when he recognized the horse. It was Tom Grady, the man who ran the trading post in town. He was in his 60s, lean and weathered, with a gray beard and a perpetual squint from years of staring into the sun. "Colt," Grady called out as he approached. "Didn't expect to find you out here fixing fences." "Where else would I be?" Grady grinned and dismounted, tying his horse to the post. "Fair point." He glanced at Mara, then back at Colt. "Got yourself some help, I see." "This is Mara Vance," Colt said. "Mara, this is Tom Grady. Runs the trading post." Mara nodded. "Nice to meet you." Grady tipped his hat. "Likewise." He turned back to Colt. "I was passing through and thought I'd stop by. Haven't seen you in town since November. Figured I'd check if you were still alive." "Still alive?" Colt said. "What brings you out this far?" "Got a letter for you." Grady reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "Came in a few weeks ago. Been holding on to it, waiting for you to show up. Finally decided to bring it myself. Colt took the letter, frowning. He didn't get mail. Ever. The only people who knew where he lived were long dead or didn't care. Who's it from? Mara asked. Colt turned the letter over, studying the handwriting on the front. It was neat, precise, unfamiliar. I don't know. Grady shrugged. Well, I did my part. You two take care now. He untied his horse and swung back into the saddle. And Colt, don't be a stranger. Town's still there if you need it. Thanks, Tom. Grady rode off and Colt stood there holding the letter like it might explode. You going to open it? Mara asked. Eventually. Why not now? Because I don't like surprises. Mara tilted her head. You let me stay. That was a surprise. That was different. How? Colt didn't answer. He folded the letter and shoved it into his pocket, then picked up the hammer and went back to work. Mara watched him for a moment, then did the same, but the letter stayed in his pocket, heavy and distracting, for the rest of the day. That night, after they'd finished dinner and Mara had gone to her room, Colt finally opened it. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs written in the same neat handwriting. It was from a man named Samuel Cross, a lawyer in Cheyenne. He explained that he represented the estate of a woman named Margaret Calloway, who had passed away the previous winter. According to the letter, Margaret had been Colt's aunt, his mother's younger sister, and she'd left him her property. Colt read the letter twice, then set it on the table and stared at the fire. He didn't remember much about his mother's family. She'd never talked about them, and after she died, Colt had been too young to ask the right questions. He vaguely recalled an aunt who'd visited once when he was a boy, but the memory was hazy, more feeling than fact. And now she was dead, and she'd left him a house. The property was in a town called Laramie, about 3 days' ride east. According to the lawyer, it was a modest home with a small plot of land, nothing fancy but well-maintained and fully paid off. The letter explained that Colt could claim it by traveling to Cheyenne and signing the necessary papers. He folded the letter and set it aside, his mind churning. A house in Laramie, a fresh start. A chance to leave the ranch behind and live somewhere easier, somewhere with neighbors and stores and a real doctor within shouting distance. It was everything he told himself he didn't want, but it was also everything Mara might need. The thought hit him harder than he expected. Out here, life was brutal. Every winter was a gamble, every storm a threat. The isolation wore people down and the work never stopped. It wasn't a life anyone should choose if they had another option. And now Colt had another option. He could sell the ranch, take the house in Laramie, and give Mara something better, something safer. The idea made sense. It was logical, practical, even generous. So why did it feel like giving up? Colt didn't sleep well that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about what it would mean to leave. The ranch had been his for 5 years. He'd built it from nothing, survived winters that should have killed him, and carved out a life that was hard but his. And then there was Mara. She'd chosen this place, chosen him. And he didn't know if she'd made that choice because she wanted to or because she didn't have anywhere else to go. He needed to know. The next morning, Colt found Mara in the barn brushing down one of the horses. She looked up when he walked in, her expression calm and focused. "Morning," she said. "Morning." Colt leaned against the stall door watching her work. "I need to talk to you about something." Mara set down the brush. "All right." He pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. "Read this." She unfolded it carefully and scanned the contents, her brow furrowing as she read. When she finished, she looked up at him. "You have family in Cheyenne?" "Had. She's dead now." "I'm sorry." Colt shrugged. "I didn't know her. Not really." Mara handed the letter back. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." He hesitated, then said, "The house is in Laramie. It's a real town. Easier living, more people." "Sounds nice." "It is nice. A lot nicer than this." He gestured around the barn. "Out here, it's just work and cold and trying not to die. In Laramie, you'd have neighbors, a community, a life that doesn't break your back every day." Mara crossed her arms. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to know what you think." "About what?" "About leaving." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You want to leave the ranch?" "I don't know," Colt said honestly. "But if I did, I'd want you to come with me. Mara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but careful. Why? Because you deserve better than this.
This
Better than
story
what?
was posted on the channel
This.
west of
He
betrayal.
gestured again,
Please do not
frustrated now.
repost it in any
Living in
form.
a barn, working yourself to death, spending every winter wondering if you'll make it to spring. I've made it so far. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Colt? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. The point is, I don't want you to stay here because you don't have anywhere else to go. I want you to stay because you want to. Mara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she stepped closer. I'm not here because I don't have options, she said quietly. I'm here because this is where I want to be. You say that now, but what about next winter, or the one after that? What happens when you get tired of freezing and starving and working until your hands bleed? Then I'll deal with it. She held his gaze. I'm not afraid of hard work, Colt, and I'm not afraid of this place. What are you afraid of? She hesitated, then said, losing it. The words hung between them, raw and honest. Colt looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't asking for easier, she was asking for permanence, and that terrified him. I don't know if I can give you that, he said. I'm not asking you to. Mara's voice was firm now. I'm just asking you not to make decisions for me. If you want to go to Laramie, then go. But don't do it because you think it's what I need. Do it because it's what you want. Colt didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just stood there, the letter still in his hand, and tried to figure out what the hell he actually wanted. Over the next few days, Colt couldn't stop thinking about the letter. He went through the motions, feeding the animals, mending fences, chopping wood, but his mind was somewhere else. He kept imagining what it would be like to leave, to pack up everything he owned, ride east, and start over in a place where survival wasn't a daily fight. It sounded easy, too easy. And that's what bothered him. Because the ranch wasn't just land. It was proof that he'd survived, proof that he'd built something with his own hands and kept it alive against every odd. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, but staying felt selfish. One evening, after a long day of plowing the field for planting, Colt sat on the porch and watched the sun set. Mara came out a few minutes later and sat beside him, a cup of coffee in her hands. You're still thinking about it, she said. Yeah. Have you decided? No. He glanced at her. Have you? Mara smiled faintly. I already told you. I'm staying. Even if I leave. Even if you leave. Colt turned to face her fully. You'd run this place alone? If I had to. You'd probably do a better job than me. Probably. She took a sip of her coffee. But I'd rather do it with you. The words hit him harder than he expected. Not because they were dramatic or poetic, but because they were simple, honest, real. Colt looked out at the valley, at the land he'd fought so hard to keep, and felt something settle inside him. I'm not going to Laramie, he said. Mara didn't react. She just nodded, like she'd already known. Why not? She asked. Because this is home. He turned to her. And you're here. Mara met his gaze, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Colt saw something in her eyes that looked like relief. Good, said softly. Because I wasn't bluffing. I really would have run this place without you. Colt laughed, a short, rough sound that surprised him. I believe you. They sat in silence for a while, the sky fading from gold to purple to black, and when Colt finally stood to go inside, Mara stood with him. Thank you, she said. For what? For staying. Colt looked at her, and for the first time in years he let himself feel something he'd been too scared to name. Thank you for giving me a reason to, he said. The next morning, Colt wrote a letter to the lawyer in Cheyenne. He kept it short, thanked him for reaching out, declined the inheritance, and suggested the property be sold and the proceeds donated to a widow's fund or something similar. He didn't need the money, and he sure as hell didn't need another house. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and set it aside to send the next time he went to town. Mara found him at this table, staring at the letter. You sure? She asked. Yeah. He stood and tucked the envelope into his coat. I'm sure. She nodded, and they went about their day. But something had shifted. The air between them felt lighter, less uncertain, like they'd finally stopped circling each other and stepped onto solid ground. By mid-April, the weather had warmed enough to start planting. Mara had planned out a small garden near the house. Potatoes, carrots, beans, maybe some squash if they could get the seeds. It wasn't much, but it was something. Colt had never bothered with a garden before. It seemed like too much work for too little payoff. But watching Mara dig rows in the soil with the same focus she brought to everything else, he found himself wanting to help. "You know what you're doing?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "My father taught me, before he died." "He teach you anything else?" Mara smiled. "How to shoot, how to skin a rabbit, how to tell when someone's lying." "That last one sounds useful." "It is." She glanced at him. "You're terrible at it, by the way." "At what?" "Lying. You get this look on your face, like you're trying too hard to sound convincing." Colt frowned. "I don't lie. Everyone lies." "Not me." Mara laughed. A real laugh, bright and unexpected. It caught Colt off guard, and he found himself smiling despite himself. "What's so funny?" he asked. "You." She wiped dirt from her hands and sat back on her heels. "You're so stubborn." "That's not news." "I know, but it's still funny." They worked in silence for a while, planting seeds and covering them with soil. When they finished, Mara stood and stretched, wincing slightly. "You all right?" Colt asked. "Fine. Just stiff. You've been working too hard." "So have you." "That's different." "Why? Because you're a man?" Colt opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. "Yeah, that sounded better in my head." Mara grinned. "Thought so." That night they sat by the fire after dinner, the windows open to let in the cool spring air. Colt had brought out a bottle of whiskey, cheap stuff, but it did the job, and poured them each a glass. "To the garden," Mara said, raising her glass. "To surviving another winter," Colt countered. They clinked glasses and drank. The whiskey burned going down, sharp and familiar, and Colt felt the tension in his shoulders start to ease. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Mara. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why'd you really come here?" Mara set down her glass, her expression thoughtful. "I told you. I didn't have anywhere else to go." "That's not the whole truth." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I was tired." "Of what?" "Everything, moving, running, pretending like I was fine when I wasn't." She looked at him. "I wanted to stop. And when I saw your ranch, I thought maybe I could." "Just like that?" "Just like that." She picked up her glass again. "I know it sounds crazy." "It does," Colt agreed, "but I get it." "Do you?" "Yeah." He stared into the fire. "I came out here for the same reason. Thought if I could just find a place that was mine, I'd stop feeling like I was drowning." "Did it work?" "Not at first, but it's better now." "Because of the ranch?" Colt looked at her. "Because of you." The words came out before he could stop them, and the moment they did, he regretted them. Not because they weren't true, but because they made him vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. But Mara didn't pull away. She didn't laugh or change the subject. She just looked at him, her eyes steady and warm. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. Colt's chest tightened. "Mara, I know." She set down her glass and stood, crossing the small space between them. "I know it's complicated. I know we're both terrible at this, but I don't care." She reached out and took his hand, and Colt felt the roughness of her palm against his, the calluses that matched his own. "I'm not going anywhere," Mara said. "And neither are you, so maybe we stop pretending like this isn't what it is." Colt stood, still holding her hand. "And what is it?" Mara smiled, soft, certain, unafraid. "Home." Colt didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was her. But suddenly, they were kissing, and it felt like falling and standing still at the same time. It wasn't perfect. Their noses bumped, and Mara laughed against his mouth, and Colt had to adjust his grip because his hands didn't know where to go. But it was real. And that was enough. When they finally pulled apart, Colt rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "This is a bad idea," he said. "Probably." "We're going to mess this up. Definitely." "Then why does it feel right?" Mara pulled back just enough to look at him. "Because it is." And standing there in the firelight, with the spring wind blowing through the open windows and the smell of fresh earth still clinging to their clothes, Colt believed her. For the first time in years, he let himself believe in something good. The days that followed didn't change much on the surface. They still woke before dawn, still fed the animals and mended fences
This
and
story
hauled
was
water from
posted
the
on the
creek.
channel west of the
Still
trail.
worked until their backs
Please do
ached
not
and their hands
repost
were
it
too
in any
sore to close
form.
properly. The rhythm of the ranch didn't care about what had shifted between them. It just kept demanding, relentless and indifferent. But everything felt different now. Colt caught himself watching Mara when she wasn't looking. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking. How she'd push her hair back with the heel of her hand when it fell into her face. The small smile that appeared when she thought no one was paying attention. And sometimes, when he looked up, he'd find her watching him too. They didn't talk about it, not directly. There was no grand conversation about what they were to each other now, no official declaration. It just settled into place quietly, like snow accumulating overnight. One morning it wasn't there, and the next morning it was, and neither of them questioned it. Mara moved her things into Colt's room without asking permission. She just did it one afternoon while he was out checking the cattle, and when he came back and saw her clothes folded on the chair and her boots by the door, he didn't say anything. He just nodded, and that was that. That night, they lay in bed together for the first time, the room dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. Mara fit against him like she'd always belonged there, her back to his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. "You comfortable?" he asked. "Yeah, you?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "This is strange." "What is?" "This. Feeling like I belong somewhere." Colt tightened his grip slightly. "You do belong here." "I know. That's what makes it strange." He didn't have an answer for that, so he just held her, listening to her breathing slow and even out as she fell asleep. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Colt didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling. He just closed his eyes and let himself rest. By May, the garden had started to grow. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, fragile but stubborn, and Mara checked on them every morning like they were children. "Look," she said one day, kneeling beside the rows. "The beans are coming up." Colt crouched beside her, studying the small sprouts. "How long before we can eat them?" "Couple months, maybe less if the weather holds." "That's a long time to wait for a handful of beans." Mara smiled. "Good things take time." "Is that supposed to be profound?" "It's supposed to be true." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. For a moment they just stood there, her hand still in his, the sun warm on their faces. "Thank you," Mara said. "For what?" "For letting me plant this." Colt frowned. "It's your garden. You don't need to thank me." "I know, but I want to anyway." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just kissed her forehead and went back to work. The weeks rolled forward, each one bleeding into the next. The cattle fattened on the new grass, and the horses grew restless with the warmer weather. Colt and Mara worked side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that came from spending every waking hour together. It wasn't always easy. They argued sometimes, usually about small things, like the best way to fix a gate, or whether they needed to ride into town for supplies. Mara could be stubborn when she thought she was right, and Colt had never been good at backing down. But the arguments never lasted long. They'd yell for a few minutes, realize they were both being ridiculous, and move on. One afternoon in early June, they were working on replacing a section of the barn roof when Mara stopped and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" Colt set down the hammer. "Sure." "Do you ever think about the future?" "Sometimes. Why?" "Because I do. All the time now." She sat back on her heels, her hands resting on her knees. "And I keep wondering what it looks like." "What do you want it to look like?" Mara hesitated, then said, "This, but more solid. Like we're not just surviving anymore, like we're actually building something." Colt looked at her, at the earnestness in her face, and felt something shift in his chest. "We are building something." "I know, but I mean something permanent, something that lasts." "Like what?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "Like a family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Colt's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject, but he didn't. He just looked at her and said, "Is that what you want?" "I think so. Maybe. I don't know." Mara shook her head, frustrated. I've never had that before, a real family, so I don't know if I'm even capable of it. You are. How do you know? Because you're here, and you stayed. Colt reached out and took her hand. That's what family does. Mara looked down at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. Then she looked back up at him. What about you? Do you want that? Colt thought about it. Really thought about it. For years, he'd told himself he didn't need anyone, that solitude was safer, easier, less painful. But sitting there with Mara, her hand warm in his, he realized that wasn't true anymore. Yeah, he said. I do. Mara smiled, small and uncertain, but real. Okay. Okay? Yeah, okay. They went back to work, but the conversation stayed with Colt for the rest of the day. That night, lying in bed with Mara asleep beside him, he stared at the ceiling and let himself imagine it. A future that wasn't just about surviving winter or keeping the ranch running. A future with permanence, with roots. It scared him, but it also felt right. By mid-June, the ranch was thriving in a way it never had before. The cattle were healthy, the garden was producing, and the fences were all in good repair. Colt had even managed to fix the roof leak that had plagued him for years. It should have felt like victory. But instead, Colt felt restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Not something bad necessarily, but something big. A change. And change made him nervous. Mara noticed. She always noticed. You've been quiet, she said one evening as they sat on the porch. What's going on? Nothing. Liar. Colt sighed. I don't know. I just feel like we're waiting for something. Like what? I don't know. That's the problem. Mara leaned back in her chair, studying him. You're scared. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. You get this look on your face when you're scared, like you're bracing for impact. Colt frowned. What look? That one. She gestured at his face. Right there. I don't have a look. You absolutely have a look. He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He was scared. Scared that this, whatever they'd built together, was too good to last. That the universe would find a way to take it from him, the way it had taken everything else. What if something happens? He said quietly. Like what? I don't know. A bad winter, a drought, something we can't control. Mara reached over and took his hand. Then we deal with it, together. What if we can't? Then we try anyway. She squeezed his hand. That's all we can do, Colt. Try. He looked at her, at the calm certainty in her eyes, and felt some of the tension in his chest ease. When'd you get so wise? He asked. I've always been wise. You just didn't notice. He smiled despite himself. Fair point. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the hills. And when Mara stood to go inside, Colt followed her, leaving his fear on the porch where it belonged. In late June, Mara started feeling sick. It was subtle at first, just a vague queasiness in the mornings that she brushed off as bad coffee or something she'd eaten. But it persisted, and after a week, it got worse. Colt found her one morning, leaning against the barn wall with her eyes closed and her face pale. You all right? He asked. Fine, just dizzy. How long have you been dizzy? A few days. It's nothing. Colt didn't believe her. You should rest. I'll rest when the work's done. Mara, I'm fine, Colt. She pushed off the wall and walked past him toward the house. Stop worrying. But he did worry. Over the next few days, he watched her carefully, noting the way she'd pause sometimes, her hand on her stomach, her expression distant. She ate less, worked slower, and went to bed earlier than usual. Finally, one night after dinner, Colt cornered her. You need to tell me what's wrong, he said. Mara looked up from the dishes she was washing. I told you, I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been sick for over a week. It's just a bug. It'll pass. And if it doesn't? She didn't answer. Colt walked over and gently turned her to face him. Mara, talk to me. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression torn between fear and something else he couldn't quite name. Then she took a deep breath. I think I might be pregnant. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to tilt, and he had to grip the edge of the counter to steady himself. You think? He managed. I don't know for sure, but the signs are there. Colt stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Pregnant. A baby. Their baby. How long have you known? He asked. A few days, maybe longer. I wasn't sure at first.
This
Why didn't
story
you
was
tell me?
posted on the channel
Because
west
I
of
didn't know how
Betrayal.
you'd react.
Please do not
Mara's
repost
voice was
it in
quiet,
any form.
careful. And because I'm scared. Of what? Everything. She wrapped her arms around herself. I don't know how to be a mother, Colt. I don't know if I can do this. Colt stepped closer and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then melted against him, her face pressed to his chest. You can do this, he said. We can do this. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He pulled back just enough to look at her. You're the strongest person I know, Mara. If anyone can do this, it's you. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. What if I'm not ready? Nobody's ever ready. What about you? Are you ready? Colt thought about it. Was he ready to be a father? To bring a child into this harsh, unforgiving world and try to keep them safe? The honest answer was no. He wasn't ready. He'd never be ready, but he wanted to try. I don't know, he said, but I'm willing to figure it out. Mara exhaled shakily, then nodded. Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, the weight of the future pressing down on them like snow on a roof. Heavy, but not unbearable. The next few weeks were strange. Mara's sickness got worse before it got better. Some mornings she couldn't keep anything down, and Colt would find her outside, leaning against the fence, waiting for the nausea to pass. Other days she was fine, almost normal, and they'd work side by side like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Colt found himself watching her constantly, looking for signs of danger. Was she working too hard? Lifting too much? Not eating enough? He tried not to hover, but it was difficult. The idea of something happening to her, or to the baby, terrified him in a way nothing else ever had. Mara noticed, of course. You need to stop, she said one afternoon after he'd insisted she sit down for the third time in an hour. Stop what? Treating me like I'm made of glass. I'm not. Yes, you are, and it's driving me crazy. Colt frowned. I'm just trying to help. I know, but I don't need help. I need you to trust that I know my own limits. And what if you push past them? Then I'll deal with it. Mara stood and walked over to him. I'm not helpless, Colt. I'm pregnant, not dying. He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. So he just nodded and tried to give her space. It wasn't easy. By mid-July, Mara's stomach had started to show. Just a slight curve, barely noticeable under her loose work shirts, but it was there. Colt caught himself staring at it sometimes, marveling at the fact that there was a person growing inside her. A person they'd made together. It was terrifying and incredible, and he didn't know how to reconcile the two. One evening, they were sitting on the porch when Mara took his hand and placed it on her stomach. Can you feel anything? She asked. Colt concentrated, pressing gently. At first there was nothing, then a flutter, so faint he almost missed it. Was that? Yeah, Mara smiled. That was the baby. Colt stared at her stomach, his hand still pressed against the fabric of her shirt. The baby. Their baby. Real and alive and moving. Holy hell, he whispered. Mara laughed. That's one way to put it. They sat there for a long time, Colt's hand on her stomach, feeling the occasional flutter of movement. And for the first time since she'd told him, the fear didn't feel quite as overwhelming. In August, Colt rode into town to stock up on supplies. It was a trip he'd been putting off, but they were running low on flour and coffee, and Mara had asked for fabric to make clothes for the baby. The trading post was quiet when he arrived. Tom Grady was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of canned goods. Colt, Grady said, looking up. Twice in 1 year. Should I be worried? Just need supplies. Fair enough. Grady set down the cans and pulled out a ledger. What are you looking for? Colt rattled off the list, and Grady started pulling items from the shelves. When he got to the fabric, he raised an eyebrow. Fabric? You taking up sewing? It's for Mara. Ah. Grady grinned. How's she doing, anyway? Haven't seen her since that first time you brought her through. She's good. Pregnant. actually. Grady stopped mid-reach and turned to stare at him. Pregnant? Yeah. Well, I'll be damned. Grady's grin widened. Congratulations, Colt. Didn't think I'd see the day. Neither did I. Grady clapped him on the shoulder, then went back to gathering supplies. When everything was packed and loaded onto Colt's horse, Grady leaned against the counter. You scared? He asked. Colt considered lying, then decided against it. Terrified. Good. That means you're paying attention. Grady folded his arms. Being a father's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the best. You'll figure it out. You got kids? 3. All grown now. But I remember what it was like when the first one came. Grady's expression softened. It changes you. In a good way. Colt nodded, filing the words away. Thanks, Tom. Any time. He rode back to the ranch slowly, the supplies weighing down the saddlebags. By the time he arrived, the sun was setting and Mara was waiting on the porch. How was town? She asked as he dismounted. Fine. Grady says congratulations. Mara smiled. He knows? I told him. And he says we'll figure it out. Do you believe him? Colt looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair and softened her features. Yeah, I do. By September, the baby was undeniable. Mara's stomach had rounded out, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying something precious. She still worked, though Colt had finally convinced her to scale back. No more lifting heavy loads or climbing ladders, just the lighter tasks, feeding the chickens, tending the garden, mending clothes. She hated it. I feel useless, she said one afternoon. You're not useless. I'm sitting here sewing while you do all the real work. Sewing is real work. Mara gave him a look. You're just saying that to make me feel better. Maybe. Is it working? No. Colt sat down beside her and took the needle from her hands. You're growing a person, Mara. That's harder than anything I'm doing out there. Doesn't feel like it. Well, it is. He handed the needle back. So stop beating yourself up. She sighed but didn't argue. That night they lay in bed together, Mara on her side with Colt's hand resting on her stomach. The baby was active now, kicking and shifting, and Colt could feel every movement. You think it's a boy or a girl? Mara asked. I don't know. Does it matter? Not really. I'm just curious. What do you want it to be? Mara thought about it. Healthy. That's all I want. Me too. They were quiet for a while, and then Mara said, What if something goes wrong? Colt's chest tightened. Nothing's going to go wrong. You don't know that. No, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway. Mara turned her head to look at him. When did you become an optimist? I'm not. I'm just stubborn. She smiled, then turned back, resting her hand over his. I'm scared, Colt. I know, so am I. But you're still here. I'm not going anywhere. Mara exhaled slowly, and some of the tension left her body. Good. Because I need you. I need you too. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, the baby moving between them like a promise. By October, the leaves had started to turn, and the air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter. Colt worked long hours preparing the ranch for the cold months ahead, chopping firewood, reinforcing the barn, stocking up on feed. Mara helped where she could, but she tired easily now. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and she spent more time resting than she liked. Colt didn't mind. He just worked harder to make up for it. One afternoon, while Colt was splitting wood, he heard Mara call his name from the house. There was something in her voice, urgency, maybe fear, that made him drop the axe and run. He found her in the bedroom, standing by the bed with one hand on her stomach and the other braced against the wall. What's wrong? He asked, breathless. I think it's time. Colt's heart stopped. Time? Like time? Yeah. But it's too early. You're not due for another month. I know, but the baby doesn't care. Colt's mind raced. The nearest doctor was in town, a full day's ride away. There was no time to get there and back. They were on their own. Okay, he said, forcing himself to stay calm. Okay, what do you need? Water, towels, and you. Mara looked at him, her face pale but determined. I need you to stay with me. I'm not going anywhere. He moved quickly, gathering everything she'd asked for and more. He boiled water, laid out clean towels, and helped Mara onto the bed. She gripped his hand, her breathing shallow and uneven. "You've done this before, right?" she asked. "Delivered a baby?" "No." "Great. That makes two of us."
This story was posted
almost
on the
laughed.
channel West of
Almost.
Betrayal. Please
We'll
do not
figure it out.
repost it in
You
any
keep
form.
saying that because it's true. The labor was long and brutal. Mara worked through each contraction with gritted teeth and white knuckles, and Colt stayed beside her, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when he had no idea what he was doing. Hours passed. The sun set, and the room grew dark except for the lamplight. Colt's back ached from kneeling beside the bed, but he didn't move. He couldn't. And then, just after midnight, the baby came. Colt caught her because it was a her, tiny and red-faced and screaming, and stared in complete disbelief. She was real, alive, perfect. "Is she okay?" Mara asked, her voice hoarse. Colt looked down at the baby in his hands, then at Mara. "She's perfect." He cleaned the baby carefully, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and placed her in Mara's arms. Mara looked down at their daughter, tears streaming down her face, and smiled. "Hi," she whispered. "I'm your mom." Colt sat on the edge of the bed, his hand on Mara's shoulder, and looked at the two of them, his family. "We did it," Mara said softly. "Yeah," Colt's voice cracked. "We did." They named her Clara, after Mara's mother. She was small but strong, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Colt had never held anything so fragile in his life, and it terrified him. But every time Clara looked at him, really looked at him, something in his chest cracked open a little more. The first few weeks were chaos. Clara cried at all hours, and neither Colt nor Mara got much sleep. But they managed. They took turns walking her around the room, rocking her, singing off-key lullabies that probably did more harm than good. And slowly, they found their rhythm. One night, Colt was holding Clara while Mara slept. The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire, and Clara's eyes were half closed, her tiny fist wrapped around his finger. "You're going to be all right," Colt whispered. "Your mom and I, we don't know what we're doing, but we're going to figure it out, and we're going to make sure you have a good life, I promise." Clara yawned, and Colt smiled. "Yeah," he said, "you're going to be just fine." Clara changed everything, but not in the ways Colt expected. He'd thought a baby would make life harder, more chaotic, more exhausting, more overwhelming, and it did. But it also made things simpler, because now there was a reason for everything, a reason to wake up before dawn, a reason to keep the fire burning through the night, a reason to survive the winter that was already creeping in around the edges. The ranch became something different after Clara arrived. It wasn't just land anymore, or shelter, or proof that Colt could survive alone. It was home, real home, the kind you built for someone else, not just yourself. Mara recovered slowly from the birth. The first week she could barely walk without pain, and Colt took over everything, cooking, cleaning, caring for Clara when Mara needed to rest. He was terrible at most of it. The food was bland, the house was a mess, and he changed Clara's diapers like he was defusing a bomb. But he tried. And that seemed to matter more than getting it right. One morning, about 2 weeks after Clara was born, Colt was attempting to make breakfast while holding Clara in one arm. He'd managed to crack 3 eggs into a pan without dropping the baby, which felt like a victory, when Mara appeared in the doorway. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 2 weeks. I'm going crazy." "You just had a baby." "I know. I was there." Mara walked over and took Clara from his arms. "Let me do this. You're burning the eggs." Colt looked down at the pan. She was right. The edges were already black. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. Mara sat at the table with Clara and watched him scrape the ruined eggs into the trash. "You know, most men would have just left me to handle everything. I'm not most men. I've noticed." Colt started over with fresh eggs, this time paying attention. "You feeling better?" "A little. Still sore, but better." "Good." They ate breakfast together, Clara asleep in Mara's arms, and for a few minutes everything felt normal, quiet, peaceful. Then Clara woke up screaming, and the peace evaporated. By November, the first snow had fallen, and Colt knew they were in for another brutal winter. But this time felt different. This time, he wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to protect something. He reinforced the barn walls, stocked the cellar with more food than they'd probably need, and made sure the firewood pile was twice as high as last year. Mara helped where she could, but most of her energy went to Clara, who seemed determined to never sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. "She's got your stubbornness," Mara said one night, rocking Clara by the fire. "My stubbornness? She's all you." "How do you figure?" "She knows what she wants and won't quit until she gets it." Mara smiled. "Fair point." Colt sat beside them, watching Clara's tiny fists wave in the air. "You think she'll like it here when she's older?" "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not." "What if she wants to leave?" "Then she leaves." Mara looked at him. "We can't keep her here if she doesn't want to stay." "I know, but I want her to want to stay." "She might, or she might want something different, something bigger." Colt frowned. "You think this place isn't enough?" "I think it's enough for us, but we're not her." Mara shifted Clara to her other shoulder. "All we can do is give her a good life and let her decide what she wants to do with it." Colt didn't like that answer, but he knew it was the right one. So he just nodded and added another log to the fire. The winter was hard, but they'd expected that. What Colt hadn't expected was how much harder it would be with a baby. Clara needed constant care, feeding, changing, soothing, and the cold made everything worse. The house was drafty, no matter how much Colt tried to seal the gaps, and keeping Clara warm became a full-time job. One night in late December, Clara wouldn't stop crying. Mara had fed her, changed her, rocked her for an hour, but nothing worked. Finally, exhausted and desperate, Mara handed her to Colt. "Your turn." Colt took Clara and walked her around the room, bouncing her gently. She screamed in his ear, her face red and scrunched up. "Come on, kid," he muttered. "Work with me here." Clara screamed louder. Colt tried everything. He sang to her, badly. He walked faster. He walked slower. He sat down, stood up, turned in circles. Nothing helped. Finally, out of desperation, he wrapped Clara in a blanket and carried her outside. The cold air hit them both like a slap, and Clara stopped crying. Just stopped. She blinked up at the sky, her eyes wide, and made a small sound that wasn't a scream. Colt stared at her, then looked up at the stars. They were bright tonight, sharp and clear against the black sky. "You like that?" he asked quietly. Clara made another sound, almost like a coo. Colt walked slowly across the yard, his boots crunching in the snow. Clara stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on the sky, and for the first time in hours, Colt felt like he could breathe. When he finally went back inside, Mara was waiting by the door. "How'd you do it?" she asked. "I took her outside." "It's freezing out there." "I know, but she liked it." Mara looked at Clara, who was now half asleep in Colt's arms, and shook her head. "She's definitely your daughter." "Yeah, she is." By January, they'd settled into a routine that almost worked. Colt handled most of the ranch work while Mara took care of Clara and the house. It wasn't equal. Mara's job was harder, but it was functional, and functional was all they could ask for. One afternoon, while Clara was napping and Mara was sewing, Colt brought up something that had been on his mind for weeks. "I've been thinking," he said. Mara looked up. "About what?" "About making this official." "Making what official?" "Us." Colt set down the knife he'd been sharpening. "Getting married." Mara blinked. "Married?" "Yeah." "Why?" "Why?" Colt frowned. "Because we have a kid together. Because we're building a life together. Because it feels like the right thing to do." Mara set down her sewing. "You don't have to marry me just because we have a baby, Colt." "I'm not. I want to marry you because I want to marry you." "Are you sure?" "Yes." He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair. "I love you, Mara. I don't say it enough, and I'm probably terrible at showing it, but it's true. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Officially." Mara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled. "Okay." "Okay?" "Yeah. Let's get married." Colt exhaled, relieved. "Good. That's good." "But I'm not wearing a fancy dress," Mara added, "and we're not having some big ceremony. I wouldn't expect anything less." They got married on a cold morning in February, in front of Tom Grady and his wife in the trading post. There was no music, no flowers, no guests beyond the Gradys and Clara, who slept through the entire thing. The ceremony lasted maybe 5 minutes. Grady read some words from a book. Colt and Mara said, "I do," and that was it. They were married.
This
Afterward,
story was
Grady clapped
posted on
Colt
the
on the
channel
shoulder.
West of Betrayal.
"Congratulations, you've
Please
just
do
made the
not
best
repost
decision
it
of your
in any
life."
form.
"Or the worst," Colt said. "Probably both." Mara laughed, and Colt realized he'd never seen her look so happy. It wasn't the big, obvious kind of happiness. It was quiet and steady, like the first warm day after a long winter. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara started fussing, and Mara pulled her out of the sling to calm her. "You happy?" Colt asked. "Yeah. You?" "Yeah. Good." Mara adjusted Clara in her arms. "Because you're stuck with me now." "I can live with that." Spring came slowly, the way it always did. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and mud, and the creek swelled with runoff. Clara was 4 months old now, and she'd started smiling, real smiles, not just gas, and Colt found himself doing ridiculous things just to see her face light up. Mara teased him about it constantly. "You're going soft," she said one afternoon, watching him make faces at Clara. "I am not. You made horse sounds for 10 minutes straight yesterday just to make her laugh. She liked it." "That's my point." Colt picked Clara up and held her against his chest. "You think I'm soft?" he asked her. Clara grabbed his nose. "See?" Mara said. "Even she agrees." Colt rolled his eyes, but he didn't argue. Maybe he was getting soft, but he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he had something worth being soft for. By April, the garden was planted again, bigger this time, and the ranch was running smoother than it ever had. Colt and Mara worked together like they'd been doing it for decades, each anticipating what the other needed before they had to ask. Clara was crawling now, which meant they had to keep a constant eye on her. She'd get into everything if they turned their backs for even a second. The firewood, the tools, the chickens. Nothing was safe. One afternoon, Colt found her sitting in the dirt near the barn, chewing on a stick. "Really?" he said, scooping her up. "You've got a whole house full of toys, and you pick a stick?" Clara grinned at him, dirt smeared across her face. "You're going to give your mother a heart attack," Colt muttered, carrying her back to the house. Mara took one look at Clara and sighed. "I was gone for 5 minutes." "She moves fast." "Clearly." Mara cleaned Clara up while Colt washed his hands. When they sat down for lunch, Clara between them in her chair, Colt looked around the table and felt something settle in his chest. This was it. This was the life he'd been fighting for without knowing it. Not perfect, not easy, but real. By summer, Clara was walking, or trying to. She'd take a few wobbly steps, fall on her backside, and try again. Colt spent hours following her around the yard, ready to catch her if she fell too hard. "She's tougher than you think," Mara said one evening, watching from the porch. "I know, but she's also tiny." "So were you once." "Doubtful." Mara smiled and went back to shelling peas. Colt stayed with Clara, letting her grab his fingers for balance as she took another shaky step. "That's it," he said. "You've got it." Clara took 3 more steps before plopping down in the grass. She looked up at Colt and laughed, a bright, joyful sound that made his chest ache. "Good job, kid," he said, sitting beside her. Clara crawled into his lap and rested her head against his chest. Colt wrapped his arms around her and looked out at the valley. The sun was setting, painting the hills in gold and orange, and for a moment everything was still. He thought about the man he'd been when he first came here, angry, broken, running from a past he couldn't escape. And he thought about the man
This
he was
story was
now,
posted on the
still
channel
broken,
West of
maybe,
Betrayal.
still
Please do not
carrying
repost
scars,
it in any form.
but not running anymore. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you about survival. It's not about being strong all the time. It's not about never falling apart or never being scared. It's about finding something or someone worth holding on to when everything else is falling apart. For Colt, that something was this ranch, this life, this family, and he'd fight like hell to keep it. By the time Clara turned 2, the ranch had grown. Colt had expanded the pastures, added more cattle, and built a second barn for storage. Mara's garden had become a small farm, producing more vegetables than they could eat, which meant trips to town to sell the surplus. Clara went with them sometimes, sitting in front of Mara on the horse, her eyes wide as she took in the world beyond the ranch. She was talking now, full sentences, most of them questions. "Why's the sky blue?" Where do horses sleep? Can I ride by myself? Colt answered when he could, made up answers when he couldn't, and redirected when the questions got too complicated. One afternoon, after a particularly long string of why questions, Mara leaned over and whispered, "You're going to have your hands full when she gets older." "We," Colt corrected. "We're going to have our hands full." Fair point. That fall, Colt started teaching Clara how to ride. She was still too small to handle a horse on her own, but he'd sit her in front of him on his saddle and let her hold the reins while he controlled the horse from behind. Clara loved it. She'd laugh and kick her feet and shout, "Faster!" even though they were barely moving. "She's fearless," Mara said, watching from the fence. "She gets that from you." "Please. She gets everything from you." Colt glanced down at Clara, who was grinning like she'd just won a race. "Maybe a little from both of us." By the time Clara was 3, she'd become a fixture on the ranch. She followed Colt everywhere, mimicking his movements and asking 1,000 questions about everything he did. She helped Mara in the garden, her small hands digging in the dirt, and she'd sit by the fire at night, listening to them talk about the day's work. She was smart, stubborn, and curious to a fault, and she was theirs. One night, after Clara had finally fallen asleep, Colt and Mara sat on the porch like they always did. The stars were out, bright and infinite, and the air was cool but not cold. "You ever think about having another one?" Mara asked. Colt looked at her. "Another what?" "Another kid." He thought about it. "I don't know. Do you?" "Maybe. Not right now, but someday." "You think we could handle another one?" Mara smiled. "We handled the first one, didn't we?" "Barely." "Exactly. So we're prepared." Colt laughed, and Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat in silence for a while, and Colt thought about what she'd said. Another kid. Another chance to build something good. It scared him, but so did everything else worth doing. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? Yeah. Someday. Let's do it." Mara lifted her head and looked at him. "Really?" "Really." She kissed him, soft and slow, and when she pulled back, she was smiling. "You're full of surprises, Colt Rayner." "I try." The years passed, and Clara grew. By the time she was 5, she could ride a horse on her own, help with the chores, and hold a conversation that didn't revolve entirely around herself. She was still stubborn, still fearless, but she'd also developed a gentleness that surprised Colt sometimes. She'd sit with injured animals, talking to them softly until they calmed down. She'd bring Mara flowers from the field, wilted and half-crushed, but given with such earnestness that Mara always cried. And she'd climb into Colt's lap at the end of the day and ask him to tell her stories about the war, even though he never did. "Why won't you tell me?" she asked one night. "Because they're not good stories." "But they're true." "That doesn't make them good." Clara frowned, thinking about that. Then she said, "Will you tell me someday?" "Maybe, when you're older." "How much older?" "A lot older." She sighed, dramatic and exaggerated, and Colt smiled despite himself. When Clara was 6, Mara had another baby. A boy this time, small and squalling and perfect. They named him Samuel after the lawyer who'd written the letter Colt had declined all those years ago. It felt right, somehow. Clara was fascinated by her baby brother. She'd sit beside him for hours, watching him sleep, and she'd ask a million questions about why he cried so much, and when he'd be big enough to play with. "Give him time," Mara said. "He'll get there." "How much time?" "A lot." Clara groaned, and Colt laughed. With 2 kids, the ranch became even more chaotic, but it also became fuller, louder, more alive. Colt and Mara worked harder than ever, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. Every fence they mended, every crop they planted, every animal they raised, it was all for the kids, for the future. And slowly, without realizing it, Colt stopped thinking about the past. He stopped carrying the weight of everything he'd lost and started focusing on everything he'd found. By the time Clara was 10 and Samuel was 4, the ranch had become something Colt never thought it would be. A legacy. They'd built a bigger house, one with enough room for everyone, and expanded the land to include a second pasture and a small orchard. The garden had grown into a full farm, and they sold enough produce and cattle to live comfortably. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. And that was more than Colt had ever hoped for. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Colt
This
and
story
Mara
was
sat on the
posted
new
on the
porch,
channel west of
wider
Betrayal.
now, with chairs
Please
that
do
didn't
not
creak,
repost it
and looked
in
out
any
at the
form.
land they'd built together. You ever think about how different things could have been? Mara asked. Sometimes. What do you think about? Colt thought about it. I think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked up to my fence that day. What do you think would have happened? I'd probably still be alone, still trying to convince myself I was fine. Mara reached over and took his hand. You weren't fine. No, I wasn't. He looked at her. But you changed that. We changed it, together. Colt nodded, because she was right. It hadn't been one moment or one person. It had been all of it. The work, the fights, the fear, the hope. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. Thank you, he said. For what? For choosing this. For choosing me. Mara squeezed his hand. You made it pretty easy. They sat in silence, the stars bright above them, and Colt realized something he'd been too scared to admit for years. He was happy, not in the fleeting, temporary way, but in the deep, unshakable way that came from building something real with someone who mattered. And that was enough. When Clara turned 16, she started talking about leaving, not permanently, but to see what else was out there. She wanted to visit the towns to the east, maybe find work, maybe go to school. Colt hated the idea. She's too young, he said to Mara one night. She's the same age I was when I left home. Exactly, and look how that turned out. Mara raised an eyebrow. It turned out pretty well, actually. Colt sighed. You know what I mean. I do. But you can't keep her here forever, Colt. She needs to make her own choices. What if she makes the wrong ones? Then she learns, just like we did. Colt didn't like it, but he knew Mara was right. So when Clara came to him a few weeks later and asked if she could go to Laramie for the summer to work at a seamstress shop, he said yes. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Clara left in early May, riding east with a family who'd agreed to let her travel with them. Colt watched her go, his chest tight, and didn't say anything until she was out of sight. She'll be fine, Mara said, standing beside him. I know. Then why do you look like someone died? Because I'm her father. That's my job. Mara smiled and leaned against him. She'll come back. You don't know that. Yes, I do, because this is her home, and she knows it. Colt wanted to believe her. And when Clara came back in August, sun-browned and smiling, full of stories about the town and the people she'd met, he finally did. I missed it here, Clara said one night, sitting on the porch with Colt and Mara. Yeah? Colt asked. Yeah, the town was nice, but it's not the same. This is home. Colt looked at Mara, and she gave him a small, knowing smile. Welcome back, he said. Clara grinned. Thanks, Dad. The years kept moving, steady and relentless. Samuel grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved the animals more than the work, but never complained. Clara stayed on the ranch, eventually taking over most of the daily operations as Colt and Mara slowed down. She was better at it than Colt had ever been, and he told her so. You're just saying that because you're getting old, she said. Maybe, but it's still true. By the time Colt was in his 60s, the ranch had become something he barely recognized from the broken-down plot of land he'd bought all those years ago. It was thriving, alive, full of people who cared about it. One evening, sitting on the porch with Mara, both of them gray now, their hands worn and scarred from decades of work, Colt looked out at the valley and thought
This
about the
story
man
was
he used to
posted
be.
on the channel west of
You think we
Betrayal.
did okay?
Please do
I
not
asked.
repost it in
Mara
any
looked at
form.
him. With what? All of it. The ranch, the kids, this life. Mara smiled. Yeah, I think we did okay. Colt nodded, satisfied. Because here's what he'd learned over the years. Life didn't owe you anything. It didn't promise fairness or ease or happy endings. But if you fought for the things that mattered, if you held on when everything told you to let go, you could build something worth keeping. And that's what they'd done. Not perfectly, not without mistakes or regrets, but with love and stubbornness and a refusal to give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. They'd built a home, a family, a legacy. And in the end, that was more than enough. Colt Rayner died in his sleep on a cold January night, 2 weeks after his 70th birthday. Mara found him in the morning, his face peaceful, his hand still resting on hers. She didn't cry, not right away. She just sat beside him for a long time, holding his hand, and thought about the life they'd lived together. It had been hard, brutal sometimes, but it had also been beautiful, and she wouldn't have changed a single thing. Clara and Samuel buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, the same hill where Colt used to sit and watch the sunset. It felt right. At the funeral, Clara stood beside the grave and said a few words. She talked about her father's stubbornness, his quiet strength, the way he'd built something lasting out of nothing. She talked about the lessons he'd taught her, about work, about resilience, about choosing to stay when leaving seemed easier. And when she was done, she looked at Mara and said, "He loved you more than anything." Mara nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "I know." They stood together on that hill, the wind cold and sharp, and said goodbye to the man who'd given them a home. Mara lived another 10 years after Colt died. She stayed on the ranch, helping where she could, watching Clara and Samuel raise their own families on the land she and Colt had fought so hard to keep. And when her time came, she went peacefully, surrounded by the people she loved, in the house she'd helped build. They buried her beside Colt, and Clara planted a tree between their graves, a sturdy oak that would grow tall and strong, its roots deep in the soil they'd worked together. Years later, when Clara's grandchildren asked about the people buried on the hill, she'd tell them the story, about a woman who walked into the middle of nowhere with nothing but hope, and a man who gave her a chance when he had every reason not to. She'd tell them about the winters they survived, the battles they fought, the life they built from scratch, and she'd tell them the most important thing she'd learned from watching them, that home isn't a place you find, it's something you build, with your hands, your heart, and the people you choose to stand beside. It's messy, it's hard, and it doesn't always turn out the way you expect. But if you're willing to fight for it, if you're willing to stay when staying feels impossible, it becomes something that lasts, something permanent, something real, and that more than anything is worth holding on to.